Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going to be continuing on the AP Psychology series. We're going to be going over two very interesting parts of our body, which are the eyes and the ears. And the big idea we're going to be taking a look at through this lecture is we're going to take a look at, of course, what is the makeup, the physiology of the eyes and the ears, and also how do they function. So with all these structures we're going to be going over, how do they combine to give us the ultimate function of sight and hearing? So with that being said, let's get into it. So the very first slide you can see is just a really big picture of the eye. But really what I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to be walking you guys through the very important structures that we need to know in regards to the eye, as you can see. So let's dive deep into the first structure that we need to know. So the very first structure you need to know about the eye is known as the cornea. So the cornea would be this part of the eye. It would be this very outer part here. So I'll kind of just shade in the eye here. So this part that I really not so shaded in very well is known as the cornea. So this part is known as the cornea of the eye. And really there is not a very important function of this part of the eye, but really that's just the outer part of the eye which light travels through and across. And then after light travels through the cornea, we have this kind of opening here. And if you guys are familiar, this is known as the pupil. So this kind of space in between these two red muscles, as you can see, is known as the pupil. And you're also wondering, okay, so the pupil is that space in between, right, where light travels through. But what are these muscles then that I circled? Well, those muscles actually really, their function is to dilate or to constrict the pupil, the size of the pupil, in order to allow light to pass through, more light to pass through, or to kind of limit the amount of light that passes through our eye. And again, those muscles, they are known as the iris. So those muscles are known as the iris of the eye, which control the size of our pupil. Okay, cool. So we got three structures. That is cool. But there are a couple more. So the very next structure we want to go over is this big structure here, which you can see my cursor kind of circling here. So this oval piece here is known as the lens. So that big oval piece is known as the lens. And what the lens does is that after traveling again through the cornea, light travels through the cornea, pupil, it hits the lens, and then the lens will take that light and refract it towards the retina. So for example, let's say, try my best to draw light here. Goes through our cornea, goes through our pupil, and then goes to our lens, and the lens will make that light wave travel across, again, the outer part of the eye, which is again known as the retina. So this outer part of the eye here, really this yellow part, is known as the retina of the eye. Again, there are a few images that show you guys the retina is like this part, but just know that really with the retina, it's just the outer part of the eye, which again the lens will refract it towards the outer part of the eye there. But the reason why I really labeled the retina as this yellow part is because that is where two sensory cells are located. So those two sensory cells are known as cones and rods, and we'll take a look at what those are in the next slide. But just I wanted to make you guys aware that I just labeled the retina as this part of the eye instead of this whole big part, because primarily lens will travel or make the light travel towards this part, because that is where our sensory cells will pick up on the color of the light and also allowing us to see and to convert that information again towards our understanding of the object in terms of vision. Now with that in mind, we kind of just travel. Let's travel across this yellow part here. So we go, we go, we go, we go. And then we reach this indented part, as you can see. So this indented part here, this funny, again, looking indent, is known as the fovea of the eye. So again, this is known as the fovea of the eye. And what this fovea has is, if you remembered, I mentioned there are two main sensory receptor cells, as known as the cones and the rods. The fovea contains a lot of cones. So fovea has a cluster of cones within it. And if you're ever asked a question of what the fovea does or its main purpose, you have to know that with the fovea, it's going to allow us to see the color of the object. Because cones, they contribute to the color of really what we're going to see. So just know that if there's ever a question about the fovea, just know that immediately it's about the cones, which then means that it's about color, the color of the object. Cool. And then this structure here, this part where this yellow part here gets thicker and thicker, is known as the optic nerve. So this is known as the optic nerve of the eye. And the function of the optic nerve is to convert all of that sensory information we receive through the cones, rods, and there are a couple of other cells which I will go over in our next slide. But really what the optic nerve does again is that it converts that sensory information. So again, it converts that sensory information into neural impulses. So optic nerve, we bring it down here, converts sensory information into neural impulses. Trying my best here to write it as good as possible. There we go. And yeah, after that, optic nerve converts it to neural impulses, and after that, those neural impulses will travel towards our occipital lobe. If you guys reviewed that part yet, the occipital lobe is where, again, all of that information of sight and vision is organized. So again, after neural impulses, it goes to our occipital lobe to organize, and in the end, ultimately out allowing us to see what that object is. Cool. So a lot of things going on here, but just kind of a quick recap. We have the cornea, which is this outer part of the eye. Then we have this opening, this space in between the two muscles, which is known as the pupil, which is controlled by the iris, which were the muscles I just said. And then after that, we have the lens, which is this oval piece here. And the lens refracts the light towards the retina. So light will travel towards our retina. And then within the retina, we have the fovea, really all those sensory receptor cells, which will pick up on color, and then really ultimately allowing us to see what that object is, the components of it. But really before we want that to happen, all of those sensory information will travel towards our optic nerve, and then that optic nerve will transmit that information as neural impulses, because that is how these neural impulses will be received by our occipital lobe to organize the information and to allow us to see and really see what the object is, its color, and so on. Okay, now mentioning the cones and the rods in my previous slide, you notice that I mentioned they were sensory receptor cells, right? So, and they are located, as you can see in this square box here, little below the fovea, but just know at the fovea we just have cones, and these cones here are these colored kind of structures. Again, that makes sense because, as I mentioned, the cones will allow us to see the color of the object, right? So these cones are located next to also the rods. But just know with the cones, they contribute to our color. They are located in next to the rods, but again within the fovea, all we have really are just these guys here. Okay. Now again, as I mentioned, they're located next to rods. So what are these? What are these guys? So really what the rods do is that they contribute to our peripheral vision. So our peripheral vision is really just allowing us to see the object as it is. So just to convert light into seeing the object. Just seeing the object in dim light, for example. Seeing the object. Nothing really more, because again, the rods cannot contribute to color because we have the cones that will do that job. But just know with the rods, they allow us to see the object with light. They convert light, of course, to see that object in terms of its structure. And then the cones will do the extra job to really see the color of it. And really, one interesting fact is that colorblind people just have a lack of cones. So it makes sense because with rods, again, you see the object, but cones do the extra job, as I mentioned, to see the color. But with colorblind people, if they can't see certain colors of objects, such as they can't see green, then that means they have a lack of green cones. Or if they can't see red, the color red, they have a lack of red cones. And again, as you can see blue, they have a lack of blue cones. So that's just an interesting fact, fun fact to know about how the cones and the rods are contributing to our visual perception of an object. Now above that, you can see we have bipolar cells. Now these bipolar cells are just the middle sensory cells, as you can see. They are above the cones and the rods. What they do, again, they just work together in transmitting information. So after the rods and cones receive that information, they convert it towards the bipolar cells. Bipolar cells will then transmit that sensory information towards the ganglion cells. So these ganglion cells are these bigger receptor cells, sensory receptor cells. And really what they do is that in the end, they will transmit that information, sensory information, towards the optic nerve. As you can see, right? It kind of diverges here. So know that cones and rods are the bottom. They convert sensory information towards the bipolar cells. And then in addition to the bipolar cells, they transmit to the ganglion. And the ganglion cells are the last receptor cells, right? So they are the ones that will transmit that information towards the optic nerve. And you can see again, as I mentioned, they kind of lead into the optic nerve here, right? Going out here. So awesome. So bipolar cells, ganglion cells, rods and cones, they all work together to transmit sensory information. All right. Now, with that in mind, with all the structures in mind that we just kind of looked at, how do they function in the end? Kind of a recap and review of these functions or structures, and how do they combine to give us that function of sight? So we have to consider, first of all, that light is traveled and directed towards the retina, right? So really we see the object through light. Light is really how our eyes perceive information, which is, again, as I mentioned, when I talked about the lens directed that light towards the retina, right? Light went towards our retina. Light essentially went towards our retina. Now, in addition to the retina, we had these cones and rods, right? Those sensory receptor cells, which allow us to make out the color of the light and ultimately the object we are seeing. So it's all the connections of those receptor cells that transmit information towards our optic nerve, right? So our optic nerve has neural impulses towards the occipital lobe. So that's our end goal. So sensory information, key, kind of a big kind of a step-by-step basis of how our eye receives and transmits information. First, light. So first we have light travel to our eye. Then we have sensory information, which is the job is done by our cones and the rods to make out the color and also really just the object itself. And then really with sensory information transmitted towards the optic nerve. And that information that is transmitted is in the form of neural impulses. Okay. Awesome. So I know I went over a lot of stuff there, but my second part of the video will be on the ear. As I mentioned in the very first slide, we'll be going over the eyes and the ear. But just to make this video not super long, I just wanted to break this lecture into two parts. But I hope you found this video, guys, helpful about the eye. I hope you learned more about the eye and really how These structures contribute to our function of sight. Ultimately, I hope you guys enjoyed it. So with that being said, guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the second part of the video, which will be on our ear.